Yeah, so I'm gonna say Logan Paul. I'm gonna say Jake Paul 1,000 times because, yeah, 100 is too short. So obviously I have to do this. 3, 2, 1. Jake Paul, 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 but Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, big Jake Paul, big Jake Paul, 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 get Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, get Jake Paul, Jake Paul, get Jake Paul, get Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 50 so far.
Jake Paul, Paul.
Oh, it's hard to say it over and over again.
Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul.
Hey, you're not in this. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 70. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. This is not even close. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. I could have said the whole alphabet in this time. I'm at 70. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Logan Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Poo. Wait, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 80. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 90 so far. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 100. I'm so slow at counting. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 100. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 100 try. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Oh, the 130 was takes forever. Jake Paul, 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 big Jake Paul. Whoa. Okay, 140. Jake Paul, 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 and Jake Paul. That's 150. Yeah. Jake Paul, 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 and Jake Paul. Jake Paul, 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 big Jake Paul, and Jake Paul. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Is that it? Jake Paul, Jake Paul. So there's Logan and Jake, right? Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 90. Jake Paul, 190. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 200. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 220. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 130. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 140. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Oh, it's 140. 240. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. No, I'm doing it at 1,000. Yes. 250. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 60. 160. 260. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. What's 106? 260. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 270. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 280. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Is it 290 now? Yeah. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 300. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 310. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 330. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 340. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 350. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 360. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 370 already. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Is it 360 now? Yeah. Oh, 380 then. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 390. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 400. I'm doing it for a video. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 410. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 420. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 400. 530. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 440. Jake Paul, 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 Big Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 350. 450.
Okay, how many I just say that?
1,000 times.
Okay. Who said that anyway?
Mr. B started it. Oh, now I lost count. 450. Yeah. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 460. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 470. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Is it 470? 470. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. I would say 480. Oh. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. Okay, so now I've done it 480. Yeah. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 490. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. It's 500 now. Halfway. Jeez, I've said Jake Paul 500 times. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Big Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 400 and 510. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 520. Jake Paul, 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 Big Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 530. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 540. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 550? Yeah, 550. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. So that's Jake Paul. 560 times. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul. 570. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 580. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 580? Yeah. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 590. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 600. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 610. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 620. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. What does that say? It says nothing. 5, 640. Yeah, 640. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 650. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 670, I think. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 680. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 680. Jake Paul, 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 Jake Paul. 690. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. My hands. Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul, Jake Paul. 700, man. Oh.